Okay, hey Homesteaders, welcome to another Sunday session of the Australian Homesteaders podcast, where we have conversations about traditional skills, self-sufficiency, sustainability, and the experience of homesteading in Australia. I'm your host, Amanda, from Rockpile Off-Grid Homestead, for today's chat, which is about composting, compost health checks, keeping your compost pile thriving, and also interestingly, the intersection between technology and sustainability. And with us, we have got Ashley from Monty Compost Co. Ash, do you prefer Ash or Ashley? Either? Ash?
Either's fine, whatever's easiest for you. I've been called a lot worse than it, so just whatever you want to make it.
So Ash is the founder and CEO of Monty Compost Co, which is a sustainability startup working to return all food and organic waste back into our soils. While studying at the University of Queensland and volunteering with environmental groups, she saw the massive global issue around waste and the impact potential of recycling and the role that innovative technologies could play in a solution for that, right? This inspired Monty, her company, where they have spent over 4 years researching and developing a world-first Australian-made smart compost monitor for tracking and managing organic waste. Now, welcome, Ash.
Thank you. You nailed it. That was a great introduction. There's a lot of different areas, so you did really well.
Hey, so gardening homesteaders understand the importance of compost and good soil for growing healthy, nutrient-dense plants. So you might not be speaking to a room full of absolute newbies here, right? But composting as a waste management solution for a homestead is an important aspect of sustainability and self-sufficiency, which are kind of core values of many homesteads. What sort of impact does the practice of composting, in your opinion, on a homestead have on a wider scale?
So I think that the impact, well, because for me, I got into composting and Monty, the reason I started it was for a sustainability kind of purpose. You know, I was always really into environmentalism. I was volunteering and all of that stuff. But I actually had no idea about composting. Like, I had never touched a compost bin in my life, if you can believe it, until like 5 years ago. And I had, despite being in, the environmental movement. And so I literally just one day, I'd been reading this book about sustainable agriculture, small scale growing, all of that sort of stuff. And it went into depth. And this was the first time I had found out about, the issues of soil degradation, of wasted nutrients, of runoff, of all of that stuff. That was the first time I'd ever heard about it. And one of the solutions it recommended was composting. And, composting is, I'm so in this space, so you'll have to excuse me if I go off and ramble a little bit, but I kind of consider composting a very broad kind of umbrella term for the recycling of organic waste. So, whether it's done in a pile, in a tumbler, whether you have biogas reactors as well, or you're using, chickens or insects, compost covers everything to me. So I am kind of talking about the whole general area. But what I found and what I first uncovered in this book was basically just the huge issues that are associated with organic waste. We hear all about plastic waste and we hear all about e-waste. And of course, they're both terrible waste streams. But at the end of the day, when you send those things to landfill, they typically just sit there most of the time. And that's not making an excuse at all, of course. But with organic waste, when you send it to landfill or you dump it, or it's not managed and recycled in a sustainable way, like through composting, it has so many issues. It produces high warming potential greenhouse gases, things like methane and nitrous oxide. So they have a far higher warming effect on the planet than carbon does. It also produces leachate, which is this nutrient-rich kind of fluid that ends up polluting surrounding waterways, ecosystems. And something that's not really environmentally related, but still so important, is its impact on kind of hygiene and disease. So one of the things that really got me over the line and got me really passionate about composting is the impact it has, particularly in developing countries and rural areas when it's not managed. 80% of disease vectors in developing countries come from organic waste being improperly managed. So it attracts things like, rodents and disease carrying insects, and just all of these awful things. So by taking responsibility for your organic waste, which can make anywhere up to 60% of the domestic waste production, you're immediately stopping. So and that's the other thing, is that a lot of people, they think of organic waste as just food waste. It's not. It's also tissues, it's soiled cardboards, basically anything that isn't plastic, metal, or glass that can go into your compost. So like the moment you start composting effectively, you will realize just how little waste you go through, and how my household, all the places I've lived that compost, we're pretty much zero waste. Like all we have are glass bottles and maybe too many beer cans. But you realize just how much you can actually take control of your own waste production when you have access to something like composting. So I think that's kind of a high level summary of the impact you're making. You're stopping those bad gases, you're stopping that pollution, and you're just overall getting that end product, which is completely another different area of the organic fertilizer aspect, which is the end product of composting, which is, like we were saying before, that soil amendment. You can reduce your reliance on chemical fertilizers, which are another environmental disaster. So there really is just so much, so many great things that come out of restoring that organic cycle.
I'm interested, okay, so we've established, yes, even on a household level, it can make a big difference to, on a wider scale, just managing your own organic waste. And like you said, not just food waste, like us gardeners know, we'll lay down cardboard, we can use the cardboard, we can use anything that will break down to, to the worm farm or whatever. So you kind of discovered this passion, like you discovered composting and you just went all in. Like
I went all in
5 or 6 years ago, or however long that was. So tell me, I'm curious to hear more about that journey. Like, how did you deep dive? Like, what was the research you were doing that ultimately ended up with Monty, which we'll go into in a bit, but I'm interested in that kind of deep dive process.
Went straight into the metaphorical compost pile of work. So yeah, I literally had no background. I didn't study compost. I studied business management and IT. I never had a compost pile growing up. No experience to it, no exposure to it. But I was really deep in the environmental action, sustainability space, all of that. I was really passionate about it. I always knew that was what I wanted to do with my life in some capacity. And then it just was in my final year of uni, when I was kind of trying to figure out what to do with my life, that I read this book, and that I came across, I guess, the power of God. I sound like a born again composter, but genuinely, I came across it, and I was just so immediately struck by, the potential that organics recycling has in our kind of mission to make a more sustainable planet. And I think what got to me more was that I really was very involved in environmentalism and volunteering and all of that, but I hadn't once heard about composting. I'd ever. And I think that's a really common thing that everyone would be familiar with. Like when you hear people talking about, oh, we need environmental action, what do you hear? You hear electric cars, you hear solar panels. You never hear compost, even though it has potential to offset, 10, 15, some measures say 20% of global emissions by making making out 25% of global emissions is from agriculture, and it's because our agricultural systems are linear. Composting has that potential of making them circular, of turning them into carbon sinks instead of carbon producers. And I think the moment I kind of found out all of this, it really was just very much a brainwave moment. And yeah, so then I just started researching it. There was a kind of a competition for a business idea related to sustainability at my university. And the application was meant to be like 5,000 words. And I ended up writing like 15,000 words. And it was just, I just poured myself into it for like 6 months, all I thought about. And yeah, then I ended up winning that, got some money to start up a company. And yeah, that's kind of been my life since then, is trying to really help this, I guess, crusade of compost, help more people recycle their organic waste, and whichever way works for them.
Okay, so that's, I mean, yes, we're a homesteading community. You're kind of preaching to the converted a bit here.
Yeah, I hope so.
I think everybody here listening will probably already be pretty passionate about their compost pile. But I'm interested to hear about what problems or what are some of the things that can go wrong with compost that you were trying to address by, I guess, through your product development. So let's talk about the compost itself. Like, what can go wrong, that you can address through monitoring, and how do you identify when things go wrong when you've got an unhealthy compost pile?
So I think when I first kind of started Monty, I was very much coming from the perspective of a newbie. I had no idea about it. So there was already that kind of barrier that I know a lot of people face when they're getting started with composting, which is, oh my gosh, this is also overwhelming. I've thrown all my stuff out in a normal bin and I know that gets, smelly. How am I going to be going if I'm piling it all up together? And are there going to be rats? They're going to be odors. So there was already that kind of newcomer hesitation that I saw was a big problem. And then as I got into it, and as I saw, all the different kinds of composting that people do, whether it's in a bay or whether it's a big pile or whether it's a tumbler, whatever kind of setup there is, there's always common problems that occur. It could be odors, which are due to a number of reasons, which may be an imbalanced feedstock or too much moisture. And, those things could occur. Too much moisture could happen, again, because your feedstock, or it could be your climate, or it could be the setup of your compost. I think a lot of people, it's correct to say that organic waste will eventually decompose, but composting is the act of managing that decomposition. And if you're not managing it correctly and effectively, you're firstly going to get problems with your composting, and that's those odors, smells, pests, and the speed of decomposition. And then secondly, you're not going to have as good an outcome at the end as possible. So the end product of compost is this decomposed organic material that can now be used as a soil amendment or an organic fertilizer. It's just this really nutrient rich end product. But depending on how effectively you're composting, you can retain a lot more of those nutrients, you can retain more carbon for your soil, you can improve the diversity and the volume of the microbiome that gets added. So if you're not composting correctly, you're going to face those problems, but you're also going to have an end product that's just not as valuable as it could be. So I think all of those issues I identified as areas of improvement for, new and old composters alike. And that's kind of what I set out to try and solve.
Okay, so we talked about, you mentioned the nutrient density of the end product and having superior microbiome of a good compost. Let's dive into that a little bit more. How what different things can you do during the composting process management that will produce a nutrient superior kind of outcome?
So probably the biggest, like one deciding factor of the nutrient quantity is going to be the speed of decomposition. Basically, the faster you can get to a usable end product, the more nutrients will have been retained in that, because they won't be either emitted as gases like nitrous oxide, and they won't have leached out as kind of liquid fertilizer. And there are ways around that. So if you have like a worm farm, for example, you know, a lot of people get worm tea and things like that. So you're still preserving the nutrients in that way. But basically, if you've got a pile of compost that you're just continuously adding to, and, you know, it's been going on for years and it's just flat on the surface of the ground, you've probably lost a lot of the nutrients that you'll get from it. Now, that's not to say that it's useless. It's still a really valuable kind of soil amendment. You'll still be adding, you know, that organic material into your soil that helps improve it. But if you're looking to use your compost as kind of a fertilizer instead of just a soil conditioner, then you want to be trying to get as fast a turnaround as possible from organic waste to organic fertilizer. As an example, there's something called mortality composting. I'm not sure if anyone is doing it, but it's when you use composting. It's when you use composting to like manage dead livestock. So if anyone has like chickens or pigs, but I was talking to someone and he managed to compost some dead pigs in less than 11 days.
Okay.
So yeah, so
wow.
they had a very big compost operation going, and
that's interesting.
It's not going to be happening. Yeah, it was very. I don't know if I should have, like, if that's kind of the topic of
that's fine, and that's perfectly fine for this audience. But there's probably I already know some people that are doing something similar that will be watching this, so this is perfect audience for that, and that is something like super interesting. So don't fear about talking about that sort of stuff.
It's fascinating, like how fast you can break down organic waste into something that's usable for your plants. So I would just say, but again, that does take more effort. That takes more management time. You have to be turning it over much more regularly. You have to have, you know, usually it's at least half a ton to a ton of organic material piled together at once. So it's not possible for everyone. Wow. But it's still definitely, you know, that's the challenging thing, because I could literally talk about it until the pigs come home to compost. But there are so many different ways. There's so many different ways of composting, depending on your feedstock levels, what you're producing, what your property's like, all of that stuff. And the way that you can maximize your output is going to be dependent on all of those different factors. So I think for me, and that's probably one of the biggest things I've seen in my journey, is that every composter is as unique as every homesteader. You know, there's not going to be a one size fits all, and trying to offer solutions that make it more understandable to people is, I think, it's still a really big gap.
Wow. Okay. So
that was kind of a tangent. I'm so sorry. That was just
that's great. I'm just trying to. There was a few interesting things that I want to pluck out. One, I really like the idea, because there's a lot of us that might do like that kind of cold composting where we just put it over there and then eventually it turns into soil. Like that's, you know, and like, it's that's really
totally fine.
Yeah, I mean, yes, definitely totally fine. But it's, if someone is looking to get the most benefit and nutrients out of their compost as possible, knowing that if they manage it in such a way that it turns over faster, they're going to end up with a more nutrient dense result. They can intentionally do that, which is really interesting. And I'm guessing being able to do that is about managing, like, what are we managing? Like, when you're managing your compost to get that, like, what are the different elements we're managing here?
So I think that, like, that's my thinking about it that way is my favorite way of thinking about what composting is. Just to preface that, is that composting is just managed decomposition, the same way that growing plants is just managed plant growth. It's a natural process that we're controlling and managing in such a way to get a certain outcome from it. So when it comes to composting, I like to simplify it into three things that you're trying to control for. And those are the diet, the carbon nitrogen ratio, the moisture levels, and the oxygen levels. And so those three things are typically what industry looks for as well. And they're very interrelated. So you affect one, you'll affect the other. So it can get very complicated, but just to break it down, firstly, carbon nitrogen ratio, everyone's probably heard about that. That's really just the balance of nutrients that constitutes your entire pile. So every piece of organic material is going to have its own unique carbon nitrogen ratio. It's also going to have its own unique density and pH level and so many other different factors. But the overall CN ratio is what the combined ratios of everything that goes in its various different quantities are. Now that it becomes kind of like a second nature thing when you've been doing it for long enough. It's a little bit of a Goldilocks ratio, not too much of this, not too much of that. The reason why it's important is because for what is actually doing the decomposition, which is all of those microbes, they need to have certain amounts of both carbon and nitrogen to, populate and to grow and to thrive. And if they don't have enough of one or the other, then that will limit their progress. So if you've got too much nitrogen, a lot of that, they won't be able to grow, to consume it fast enough. So it'll be all lost as nitrous oxide. And if you don't have enough carbon, then think of that carbs for us. You won't have the energy, they won't have the energy to kind of grow and continue breaking things down.
Yep.
So I'll just go over to the next one, because there are so many different ways you can figure out what the best balance is for your particular feedstock throughput.
So can you just clarify that term there? Stock, feedstock throughput. What?
Sorry. So I'm sometimes I'll get caught up using industry terms, just because most of the research and work that's done on composting is done on commercial scale. So feedstock is just any organic waste, whether you're putting in your garden waste or your food waste from your kitchen or your domestic waste, soiled cardboard or tissues.
Gotcha.
And then throughput is just the volume that's going into your compost. So sorry, sometimes I'll get all jargony, but everyone has different volumes of that. And some households are going to have more of this than some of that. Some households are producing a bunch of manure that they can use. Some are really heavy in other things. So it's a very difficult question it's not difficult, but it's very dependent on a particular household on what their throughput is.
Gotcha.
For what kind of composting they should do. Very related to that is moisture levels. So moisture is so much simpler. Compost is so forgiving. Anywhere between 40 to 60% moisture, it'll be able to get by. So if it's too dry, basically all the microbes, they won't have a medium to live in. So they'll start to die off, and they go dormant and they can't do any decomposition. If it's too wet, this very much leads into the third kind of health metric, or that you want to be managing for, which is oxygen. If you have too much moisture, the oxygen can't diffuse through it, and the microbes that live in the moisture won't be able to breathe in that oxygen. So that's kind of what you're managing for there if it's too wet. And again, that leads to the final one, which is the oxygen. Now, the reason why oxygen is important for composting specifically is because it's kind of what differentiates composting with landfills. And that's because the microbes that do the decomposition in composting, they're what's called aerobes. So basically it just means they breathe in oxygen. So if your pile is too densely compacted or it's too saturated with water, or it's too enclosed and there's no way for new oxygen to get through, then it'll end up becoming methagenic or anaerobic, which is just these scientific words to mean that there's no oxygen in it, and the bacteria that ends up growing is methane producing microbes.
Okay.
And that's really bad because they're less effective at breaking down the organic waste. They produce all those horrible gases. It makes your compost smell. And yeah, it's just an all-around bad time. So making sure you have a way to keep your pile oxygenated, whether it's through, you know, I've seen so many people who add PVC pipes into their compost, or turning it over regularly, making sure that it's really fluffed up. So I'll try not to info dump, but one of the other ways you can manage oxygen is actually by managing the density of your pile. So one of the biggest reasons why piles don't get oxygenated is because they start to settle and compress.
Yes.
And so if you turning it over is not actually about reintroducing oxygen to the pile. It's about decreasing its density so that there's more air channels that go through it to restock the oxygen that's in there. So yeah, I guess that's probably, sorry, I honestly could talk about compost like forever, but hopefully those three kind of factors are what you want to keep in mind when you're managing for it.
Okay, and what are some of the more common ways that you see people managing them on a homestead level? You know, people might be in a tumbler, you know, cover it to protect it from excess moisture and rain. Someone in the comments has asked, is it better to leave it open or put a tarpaulin over it over the top in winter? So what are some of the different like physical ways we manage those?
Covering your compost is really good. Just having, the only time I'd say take a cover off would be if it was saturated and you needed to increase the evaporation from it. But otherwise, keeping an open pile under a tarp, or, you know, like you said, in a tumbler, it's in a container, that's really good because it allows the compost kind of a more controlled environment to do its decomposition, as opposed to when it's exposed to the elements, it'll be losing its heat, it'll be losing a lot more moisture, it'll be leaching out a lot more. So if you're able to cover it up, that'll kind of create a more controlled environment for the microbes to do their work once you have a good kind of like compost process going. So that's, I would say, like, endeavoring as much as possible to have a closed in pile. So if you're in a tumbler or a bin, you're fine already. But if you're an open pile or a bay, look for ways that you can keep it sealed off as much as possible. In saying that, you do want to make sure that there's means for aeration. So if you've got a pile or anything that's open, that's usually okay. But if you've got a bin or some kind of, you know, enclosed container, I will always, you know, those super sealed off like bins that you get from Bunnings. Every time I get one of those, I take out the hand drill. I just drill a bunch of holes on the side of it to make sure that there's some airflow it can get going. So I'd say those considerations are important. You know, it has to be fairly well controlled, but you still want to make sure that some air is getting through. And then I think once you've got that, it really does just come down to controlling the feedstock and controlling what you've put into it, and then letting it do its decomposition process fully. One thing I see a lot of people do is they just continuously add to their compost, and that can make it challenging to have an end product to work with because you're always adding new organic material to it. So that would actually be one thing that I like to recommend if anyone's like looking to compost on a larger scale, is don't try and have one really large bay or one really massive pile. Try having two smaller ones, because what it means is that you can get the process going in the first one, you can build up the pile, and then once it's full, you can let it go and you can let it decompose, let it mature, and then you can start working on the second one. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. So when you're saying tiny, massive, what's some sort of volume numbers we've got here?
So
If you're saying,
yeah, so God, so I think bins, they max out at about 500 liters, and organic materials pretty much ton for ton, like it's basically like 1 ton for every cubic meter. So for most bins, you'll just be looking at around 200 to 500 kgs that you can fit into a given bin. Considering that the average person produces, like, I think it's something like 300 kilograms of organic waste a year or something. There's lots of different metrics, but that's usually what, household smaller scale composting looks like. But then when you start to introduce things like green waste and garden waste and even animal manure, if you've got those, then you can start to look at kind of operations and bays and piles that may be up to and over a ton, which is about a meter squared. So all of those still follow the same principles which is what I love about compost. It is, when it comes to scaling up or down, you're still following the same kind of methodology of control the diet, control the water, control the oxygen, all the way up to, commercial composting, which is about 300 ton windrows. There's a commercial composting facility near where we are, which is in Brisbane, which does 120,000 tons a year. So they still follow the same sort of principles as, we're talking about now, as you'll be doing in anything as small as a tumbler.
Okay. Right, so I diverted you a little bit there, just so we could.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I feel like, I'm trying to stay on track, but there's so many things to talk about. That's all right.
We were just, you had just mentioned inputs. Can we talk about inputs? There's a few people asking about different things you can put in the pile. Can you, does it benefit to add soil? Can you compost wool? So let's talk about inputs for a start.
So it can get really complicated. I think I'm glad that you brought that up, because that can be one of the most confusing areas for people in regards to what can I put in my compost. And I like to keep it simple, and I say, is it plastic, metal, or plastic, metal, glass? If no, go in compost. But there is a bit more nuance, because certain types of feedstock will have certain impacts on your compost pile. So, for example, soil in your compost pile, people will sometimes recommend it as it will already have certain microbes in the soil that you're then adding to the organic waste as kind of a starter thing for a new microbial population. It's not necessary. All your organic waste will have bacteria on it already that will immediately populate. Bacteria grows very quickly, and it's very reactive and adaptive. So a lot of that stuff, unless you're a very active composter and you're looking for ways to experiment and to, increase the turnover time by like a day, then soil isn't going to have, or any kind of inoculant or starter fluids that you can buy, it's probably not going to have a hugely noticeable impact. Things like wool, definitely. And the funny thing is that your compost is so robust, and it's so forgiving, that even if you put things like, if fruit stickers get into your compost, if certain things that aren't ideal for it or won't break down, they get in there, due to kind of the nature of those materials, they're just going to be there at the end, and you just got to pick them out. I very much take that approach to your compost, that if something doesn't break down fully, or if it's not, technically meant to be in your compost, and it's still there at the end of the process, then just fish it out. Otherwise, you're going to be wringing your hands the whole time, wondering about every single piece of waste that you put in. So yeah, I think the big things to be just wary of is anything that has like pesticide or herbicide potential chemicals. So anything artificial, any chemicals like that, they will persist. So if you're putting in, you know, like material, there was this one case where a commercial composter, they had been composting green waste that had all of this chemical pesticide on it, and it actually persisted all the way to the Bunnings bagged fertilizer, and a bunch of people bought it.
Right.
Yeah, so it was a very rare case, but be careful when you're putting in things that may have been exposed to large levels of pesticides or herbicides, because they will persist through the composting process. And then the only other thing I'd say to be wary of is large quantities of meat or animal products. They will break down. They're organic. People freak out. So often people freak out about, oh my God, can I put meat in? Can I put citrus in? If it's organic, it will break down. But the issue is if it's going to make it more attractive to pests. I've never had a problem with putting any amount of meat in my compost. But that's just because I have a really well balanced pile most of the time. Anytime I add meat or something that could be highly attractive to rodents or things like that, I'll either just cover it in sawdust or wrap it up in paper and just make sure that the odor is very covered.
Yep.
But that's the thing, is like, if it's organic, it will break down. And it's just about having a little think about, well, what are the side effects that it may have, and then mitigating for them.
Awesome. Oh, cool. Someone, Simply Off Grid Australia, has asked a question about their compost pile is very heavy and dense, and we spoke about that not long ago. What are some strategies to manage that, to rectify it? Is it a matter of like adding more to the pile, adding more of something to the pile? Is it another way of managing the pile?
If it's too dense, and this is actually a big problem I see in tumblers, because one of the great things about tumblers is that you can just roll it over. But what that does is, as if it's really full, the material can actually compact down and become really dense and matted. So the way that I've always alleviated that, just add in a bunch of sticks. Find a whole bunch of really kind of fibrous, tough sticks and wooden material like that is going to take months to break down, because what that'll do is it's kind of just like putting in scaffolding inside your compost. And because they will maintain their structure, unlike a lot of the other materials that are very kind of dense and more compact, these branches are going to take forever to break down. So they'll kind of allow for a bit of structure in your pile. And then, like I said, if you're a bit of an aestheticist, I don't know what the word is, but if you're a compost perfectionist and you like a really good looking end product, all you have to do at the end is just pick them out and add it to the next pile. So that's a method that I've found that really helps with ensuring that you have a kind of a fluffy pile, is just adding materials that aren't going to break down and will add structure to it.
Awesome. All right. I just want to quickly recap and just go
so much.
Okay. Those three main elements that you are managing for a healthy compost pile is the feed, like what you feed it, which is the nitrogen and carbon ratios. The water, and also the oxygen, right? So when you're like managing a compost pile, you said basically you're managing, like helping grow the microbes in it and creating a suitable environment for them. So that's
exactly it.
There's not that, it could be various sizes. It can be a small pile to a massive 30-ton windrow, or a tumbler, or a 1 cubic meter in a bay, and so there's no one perfect way of actually containing it, covering it, it just depends on like your circumstances and your management style. So, and you're just trying to get that balance between those three elements.
Exactly.
Yeah, and like dense, like reduce, trying to make sure it doesn't get too dense is important. Managing your inputs is important. And what was the other thing? Oh, and we also touched on earlier for people that are just jumping in, how you can actually manage it in such a way to get a superior, like a more nutrient dense outcome.
Exactly.
And you do that by, managing it so it comes to, readiness faster, essentially.
That was a really good
right?
that was a really good recap. I was kind of forgetting what I'd been saying. I feel like you just set me on a topic for composting and I'll just ramble along.
No, that's great. That's perfect. So if you have like when you turn it and like aerate it, what is that something useful? Like, do you turn it in place? Do you turn it into another bay? If someone has like a multiple bay setup, for example, I know we're not just looking for like an ideal setup, but if you've got a little bit of room or you've got room for multiple bays, what would be a pretty functional setup for managing a compost farm?
I think an ideal setup is any kind of multi-stage composting. So whether they're bays or whether they're piles or whether they're even bins, like you'll see this happen a lot in community gardens, which are like, they have to be on urban land, they can't just have big open piles. So having like a staged process to it, I think no matter what kind of compost setup it is, as long as you have that aspect of it, I think that is what makes for a really effective composting process. Because like I said before, what it means is whether you're filling up a bay or filling up a bin or creating a new pile, like composting goes through stages. It'll go through kind of, there's scientific names for it. You can call it like a mesophilic phase or a thermophilic phase, but most of the time we just say active composting and then the maturation. So as long as you have separate stages for them, where in the active composting it's just doing the breaking down, you're not adding more materials to it, you're turning it over and you're watering it when needed, but it's able to do its thing. And then when you get to the maturation stage, when it's finished that, it's just completely left alone. And then, sorry, I missed before, but at the building stage, when you're adding all the new materials and you're building up the pile, that's that first stage. So I think doing that is a really big fit. And that can be as little as 2 bins. You've got the building and active composting, and then you've got a maturing pile. It can be done in 2 bins, it can be done in 2 tumblers, it can be done in 2 bays, 2 piles. But doing that, it kind of gets rid of a big problem that I see in a lot of composters, is that they're saying, oh, my compost is never breaking down. It's like, well, that's because you're adding new organic waste to it constantly. It's probably finished breaking down at the very bottom of the pile, but that's super inconvenient and not the most effective way, because even if it is partly broken down near there, you'll probably have not completely finished organic waste mixed in. So you just end up getting a very inhomogeneous end product.
Yep.
So it's a mix of stages of decomposition. Whereas if you do this multi-stage process where you actually get it through and you let it break down without constantly adding new things to it, then you'll have a really clean, nice end product. So I'd say to anyone who's looking to up their composting game, just invest in a second piece of equipment, or even if you're just doing a bin, just once your bin is full, kind of maybe store your organic waste somewhere else for a few weeks while it's breaking down, empty it out into a pile and cover it off with a tarpaulin, like someone said, a tarpaulin. Sorry, it's not a tarpaulin. But yeah, there are so many different ways of doing it. But I think as long as you're kind of following those different stages, that'll really improve, I guess, the end product, because it's been able to do the proper decomposition.
Awesome. Okay, so I mean, there's a couple more questions. Someone was asking how often should it be turned, and et cetera, et cetera.
Actually, oh yeah,
oh, you want to answer that?
I was just going to say, because you mentioned it before, there's a lot of misconceptions with turning. So a lot of people think turning is to add oxygen, and it's technically not directly at least. So there are some studies and they found that like the oxygen that's introduced during a turning event can be used up in a hot pile, and even in cold piles, it can be used up by the microbes in as quickly as 20 minutes. So
Right.
turning is not actually just the addition of oxygen. Turning is more for two main reasons, is for increasing the decreasing, I always get them confused, decreasing the density of a pile, so fluffing it up, re-adding the channels that go through it for passive aeration,
yes,
as well as what's called the homogenization of the pile, which means turning it over and mixing it up and making sure that all the different materials are really mixed in well together. Because I think a lot of people do like layering of their compost, and that's really effective in building a pile. But in terms of having an end product that's really well kind of blended together, so you don't have patches of really nitrogen rich material here and then patches of kind of just basic low nutrient materials right there.
Yep.
You want to get it all blended in. So that's more the function of turning. It's still very important for the aeration and adding oxygen to your pile, but that's just a little bit of a common misconception people have about turning a pile. Fun fact.
Thank you. Okay, so all right, so through your research and you development, you were particularly interested in the ways technology could help improve people's compost. Some people do it by feel. We've discussed that kind of. Some people use formulas, and going the tech route won't be for everyone, and that's okay. But I am super intrigued by your product. Now, for those that weren't here at the beginning, Ashley is the CEO of a company that has researched and developed a product for helping manage compost. Now, to be clear, I reached out to Ashley a while ago for this chat. It's not sponsored. I haven't received anything for free. I'm just super intrigued by tech. I love all things tech. Can you tell me how this the Monty, which is you can also explain what that's like, what that name's based off. How does that help you manage all these different elements that you've been telling us about? Like, what's the deal? What's the deal with it?
Yeah, of course. So, and to preface, it's definitely every composter is unique, and some won't need extra support or a tool or anything like that at all. Or some people are just fascinated by it for different reasons. So, yeah, not prescribing this to everyone at all, but I guess because coming from my background, like I said, one of my degrees was in information technology. So I was coming from this world and seeing all the ways that technology had been used to solve different problems. And as I was kind of learning more about the problem of not everyone composts or not everyone composts effectively or correctly, I was kind of looking to my background in technology for ways to solve it. And so what I kind of came up with was, we need to be composting more effectively, or we need to make it easier for people to do who aren't doing it. So what technologies are available that could help us with that? So I kind of looked to a lot of those new smart devices that were coming out, and how kind of by monitoring any given process, you can actually measure and manage it better. And so that's where the word Monty came from. And this was what we ended up developing. It's always
nice.
I know, it's always good to
not a microphone.
No, everyone says it looks like a microphone, but basically, after 4 years of development, I kind of conceptualized a tool that was going to help people understand their composting better and therefore manage it better. So that's where Monty Monitor came to fruition. It's really simple. If anyone has a thermometer for their compost, it's like that, except 10 levels better. Basically, it has a temperature sensor, but also a humidity and odorous gas sensor, whole bunch of other kind of pieces of data that are tracked. And you just stick it into your compost, and it sends all that information to our smartphone app. And that gives you insights into what's happening inside your compost on kind of a 24/7 basis. You just leave it in there, gives you insights on what's happening in your compost and ways to improve it. So we found that by offering, this kind of compost companion, this compost coach, something that's always keeping an eye on it, it helps people overcome a lot of the barriers of not knowing how to improve their composting, being disengaged with it, not finding it very interesting or exciting, as well as a lot of other kind of insights that add a lot of value. So for example, by tracking the gases, we're able to learn, how much in emissions are you actually helping offset with your composting?
Hey, that's cool.
And we're doing a lot of active research because it's a very kind of world first area. For some reason, no one's really been interested in technology for compost. I don't get it, and I'm sure no one here gets it because compost is awesome, but it's not a very cool area in the technology world. So what we're doing is very world first. But we're also looking into ways of, predicting what's the exact nutrient ratio of your composting based on all the emissions that it's producing. And then, finally, we're also working with, a lot of different applications as well. So not just worm farms or tumblers, but also larger scale composting operations, biogas reactors, all of those different things that are just kind of looking for new innovations to help do it better. And it's made in Australia. So Southeast Queensland, we've made it there. And it's been a lot of work. Compost is not very forgiving. Imagine I just like we've done about 10 prototypes by now, and one of the first ones that we released as like a limited launch, it had like an 80% failure rate. It was so devastating. Oh my god, we put like 20 of them out there and all of them broke because imagine putting your phone in your compost, it's so wet, and one of them got infected with ants. And so
oh, poor Monty.
So I know, poor Monty. So it's been a long journey, but we've finally got 100% working, and we've got a whole bunch of them out there across Australia. And it's really exciting being in this area.
That's incredible, and congratulations on getting it getting out there, and it's an Aussie business, and it's really, really super innovative. So,
and I actually wanted to say as well, we for any of yourself or your viewers, we wanted to offer a special discount for you guys.
Ooh, like discounts.
You can get a Monty for our lowest price of $99. It's a super duper special discount.
Okay.
Yeah, so down from $249, very limited time, but it's OzHome23. I will copy the link into the chat after this. But that's just something that we want to offer.
Wow, thank you. That's a nice surprise.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's very tough being an early stage tech startup in an area like composting, but meeting you and connecting with communities like this make it all worthwhile.
I was intrigued by your product. I didn't really know a lot about the background and everything that's sort of gone into it. And I'm so glad that we connected, because this has been super, super interesting, and I think it's been really valuable for our listeners and our audience. I'm just going to double check to see if there's any last minute questions. So useful to ask the soil one. We asked a tarpaulin one. Someone asked, would a woolen blanket be better to aid in oxygen as opposed to covering it with a tarp? Because I'm guessing, but would the woolen blanket start breaking down?
Might start to break down, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it might. Wool is quite fibrous, so it may take a little while. But it is also, yeah, like they observe, porous, so may let in a bit more oxygen. I'm not sure actually. I've never thought about that, but yeah, I imagine it would provide some insulation still, but you may run the risk of it just completely breaking down on top of your compost.
Also, oh, someone has asked, is feedback to you from any homesteaders that take up the offer useful in your development process? Is that something that you welcome?
It is absolutely welcome. So we have our mobile app is actually free to download, Monty Mobile, and we actually have a little form in the app that gives direct feedback to our whole team. You know, we have over 100 composters using Monty now, as well as over 20 schools, and we're constantly working with them to improve, particularly the software, how all the data is delivered, all of the insights that we're getting, just because we're so early stage and it's such a continuous learning process. So that's another reason why we want to get, you know, really engaged, committed composters in, because it's going to help us make the best product possible.
Someone has asked, would it work okay with the app when the reception is terrible in the garden, or we might be talking to people that are in remote areas and have, like, you know, patchy reception?
For that exact reason, we actually made Monty Bluetooth connected. So you connect, because so many people's compost was out of range of their Wi-Fi. So we made it Bluetooth connection. We have had some, because you need to connect to the monitor and to some kind of internet connection. So we are working on making it more more offline, so you don't need to connect to it at all. But in those cases, all you need to do is just move the Monty to somewhere that you're in range, and because it's so small and portable, that's really simple to do.
Awesome, that's great. Now you said that incredibly generous offer, is that until a certain date? What's our time frame there?
It's for the next week. It's available. So yeah, just to say thank you for having me, and to really start to engage more with the committed homesteading community and their composting. You can get Monty Monitor for $99, down from $249, anytime from now to end of next week. Yeah, okay, I'm really happy to offer it.
So end of next week, let's get today it's Sunday, 7th of May. So let's give a date in case someone's watching this later.
So this time, 14th of May.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful.
I'll send you the link and everything.
Wonderful. Everyone's saying thank you. That's so generous. Thank you so much. That sounds amazing. Thanks. So we're probably going to start wrapping up now. Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you online, your website, if you've got any other socials where they can find you, and more information about the product.
We are Monty Compost Co, or on the website, or Monty Compost Co on our socials. I'll send you the link after this for the discount code, but it'll just be whatever made it, OzHome23. So
Oz
we have
with
so much
OZ or AUS?
AUS.
Okay.
Home 23. So we have so much information out there about composting, about the work that we're doing. Like I said, we're entirely Australian, designed, developed, built down in the Gold Coast. And yeah, we're always online. We're very much a new business, but we're working really hard to make something great for composters out there. We're all our whole team's just really passionate about the potential that is in the space of composting. And it is so inspiring connecting with, I think I found the homesteading community is like one of the best kind. I'm genuinely not just saying that, it's just in the gardening space. We're really looking for people who are passionate about being better connected with what's going on in their compost and how they can improve it. And I think we've really appreciated the value that homesteaders put into that that part of their operation. So yeah, it's just been really great connecting with you and talking about this, and I hope I haven't bored anyone too much about just
nobody here, everyone else is passionate about it. So thank you so much for all your generous information. I love the info dumping, like anytime is fine.
If anyone has any compost questions, just send them through to us and we'll get on to them.
Awesome. All right, well, we will say goodbye to our audience now, and hope everybody really enjoyed that. We did, and we'll see you all later. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you all so much.